All right. Welcome, everybody. Glad that you are here tonight. We're going to dive in and get started. If you've been here for the last couple of weeks, then you know that we have been in the book of Deuteronomy together. And just last week, we wrapped up one of Moses's big sermons, one of his big speeches that he gives. He gives a series of sermons during the book of Deuteronomy. They're right on the precipice. They're right across the Jordan River. They're about to enter into the promised land. And Moses is giving these sermons to remind the people of God's law, of what God is calling them to do, of how he's calling them to live. Moses doesn't get to go with them into the promised land. He's sending this generation that's come of age as they've been once, and he's going to send them into the promised land. And these are the final remarks that he's going to make in his life, final reminders, the last chance that he gets after walking with these people for 40 plus years. And now he's got, okay, this is the last chance I have to say something to you. And so tonight we're going to dive into a new section of the book of Deuteronomy. We'll be in the section of Deuteronomy that he recounts the law to the people. Will be tonight, and for 4 more weeks we'll be going through different portions of the law that Moses reshares with this new generation and reminds them of. And Moses does this not because he wants to be a Debbie Downer as they're about to enter into the land. Sorry, Debbie's. Not because he wants to be a negative Nancy. Sorry, Nancy's. Why is it always a woman's name, right? Like, he's not going to be a moody Moses. How about that? Okay. Okay, Gloomy Gus. Oh, I forgot about Gloomy Gus. There you go. So he's doing this for a specific purpose and a specific reason. And so even though when we often read sections of the Old Testament that sound like a law code, it sounds more like you're reading like a history book that's the most boring history book you've ever read. Sometimes that's how we can feel about reading Old Testament law and things like that. He's sharing this for a reason. There's a purpose behind it. And so I'm going to go, Mark, I'm already going to go off script. Sorry. I give Mark my notes so he can follow me, as with the slides and everything. And here I am. I'm not even half a page into notes. I'm going off script. But I was just thinking that this would be a good way for us to kind of enter into this conversation tonight. When you think about the Old Testament law, whether that's reading it or what it has to say, what are some of the, in maybe one sentence or less, right? I don't want to get us stuck here. This is the very beginning of the lesson. We got a lot of ground to cover tonight. But what do you think of when you think of the Old Testament law? Like a sentence, a phrase, a word. What do you think of when you think of the Old Testament law? Yeah.
What kept the Israelites apart, allowed them to survive in modern day?
Oh, see, I shouldn't have even asked, because that's basically the right answer right there, So, but no, that's exactly right. It set them apart from the people that they lived around. It identified them as a people. It continues to this day to identify them as a specific, called out people with a specific purpose. That's a really good answer. Okay, what else? It can be very personal, and it can even be like, it's hard to read, anything. So what else when you think of the Old Testament law? It's older. Okay. It's existed for thousands of years, right? Like at least 3,000 plus years we're talking about here, that this law was given to the people of Israel from today, 3,000 plus years ago. So this has been around for a long time. Tested, tried, and true, perhaps, right? Okay. Anything else? Detailed. Let's give a little bit more on that, Denver. What else you got in the tank? Yeah. Okay, that's really good. It's very specific, isn't it? It gives you detail after detail, book, chapter, and verse, right? About this is how you do this process. This is how you give this sacrifice. This is what you do on this particular day. So detailed. Yes, that's great. One more? Anybody else?
Brought order out of chaos.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's really good. It brought order out of chaos. It helped to say this is going to be the thing that grounds you. And when you don't know what to do in life, come back to this. Don't let the chaos of your choices, of your life, of the world around you direct you. Let this be the thing that directs you. Okay, good. That's wonderful. Okay, so as we enter into this law tonight, the next couple of weeks, I want to make a statement that will maybe sound contradictory, but I'll try to explain it here a little bit. The law that the Israelites are going to follow in some ways, is going to make them exactly like other groups of people that have existed all the way throughout history. But the law is also going to make them extremely different than other groups of people that have existed throughout history. What I mean by that is what God is revealing to them and asking them to follow when he gives them this law is not going to be all that different from some of the other things that other groups of people or even other ancient religions did. For example, there's going to be a lot of instruction. In fact, there already has been in the book of Leviticus. That's where most of the instruction is going to be found on this, but about how to sacrifice. Sacrificing animals was not unique to the people of Israel. It's going to have something contained in it that was common for the ancient world. And yet, the way that God is asking them to follow him by giving them this law, to John's point earlier, is going to set them apart, right? It's going to be different. There's going to be aspects of it that Israel's doing things a little bit differently than the ancient world. So another example on that, we're going to read, especially next week, we'll dive into this more next week, but God's going to give some laws about how to practice slavery in their nation, in their context. Slavery was a common ancient practice. Even today, slavery in some parts of the world continues to be a practice in our world. But God is going to give them instructions that's going to set this nation apart, how they're going to live, how something like slavery that today we look back on and we say, how could they even practice this? But God's going to give them instructions. It's going to be different in Israel. You're going to practice this not in the same way that the nations and religions around you practice this. You're going to practice this in a way that shines through the heart of God. You're going to see the heart of God, even in a practice like that. So we'll dive. I probably just opened a can of worms tonight by mentioning that specific practice. But we're going to dive into it next week. So maybe it's a teaser also. Like, come back again next week. We'll dive into that together. So there's going to be some things in this law that are so common and normal and usual for the ancient world that it doesn't make them sound very different. And yet what God is doing with this law is he's making them into a very different kind of people. Does that make sense? That sounds contradictory a little bit, like we're dealing with some of the same things that were common in the ancient world, but God is going to ask them to do things, to live out their following of him in a different way than what some of these other ancient groups perhaps were used to. Okay, so the law to us sometimes can feel overwhelming. Sometimes maybe it feels cumbersome. There's too many details to keep track of. How on earth could a person ever follow this perfectly and well? But what we're going to read in the next couple of chapters, the next couple of weeks, these are vital reminders that Moses is giving to the people about what God's heart is, what his desire for them is, and how together in relationship they can live with one another. That's really ultimately what the law is about. The law is about how can God, a perfect, holy God, live with this imperfect, unholy people, and God's law is going to be what tries to bridge the gap here. Now, we can fast forward a couple hundred years, 1,000 years after the law is given, and we can talk about how when we get to Paul teaches and recognizes that the law is temporary, right? It's not meant to be the final thing. Christ is ultimately the only thing that can get a perfect God and an imperfect people to live in perfect relationship with each other. But Israel is given this law. They're given this law, and this is the way that God begins to direct them towards relationship with him. Okay, so tonight we've got 3 chapters of Deuteronomy that we're going to cover. We're going to do a decent bit of reading. These 3 chapters really have to deal with 3 different topics for the most part. Chapter 12 primarily deals with where to worship. Remember, this is a people that for 40 years have been a nomadic people. They've been wandering in the wilderness. And now they're going to enter the promised land, and they're going to change from being a nomadic people to being a people with a permanent residence. And so how do you worship? How is God going to direct their worship once they come into the promised land? Chapter 13 is primarily going to be about idolatry. And we talked about this last week. God is intent. He is very specific. You cannot take on the gods of the people whose land you're going to enter into. And so we're going to talk again about idolatry in chapter 13. Chapter 14 primarily deals with food laws. And what I tend to find is that this is one of those areas that really slows us modern readers down. Like, okay, where to worship, idolatry, those are things that we still get. But food laws, that's kind of where we draw the line sometimes. Like, God, you can't tell me what to eat and not eat because I like my bacon on my burgers, right? But we'll see what we can do there with food laws in chapter 14 as well. So, okay, let's dive into chapter 12 and read a little bit and see if we can't come to some kind of idea of what we can take away from Deuteronomy 12 today. So let's start Deuteronomy 12, verse 1. Moses says, "These are the decrees, the laws you must be careful to follow in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to possess, as long as you live in the land. Destroy completely all the places on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every spreading tree, where the nations you're dispossessing worship their gods. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, burn their Asherah poles in the fire. Cut down the idols of their gods and wipe out their names from those places. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, but you are to seek the place the Lord your God will choose from among all your tribes to put his name there for his dwelling. To that place you must go. There bring your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and special gifts, what you have vowed to give in your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. There, in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your families shall eat and shall rejoice in everything you have put your hand to, because the Lord your God has blessed you. You're not to do as we do here today, everyone doing as they see fit, since you have not yet reached the resting place and the inheritance the Lord your God is giving you. But you will cross the Jordan and settle in the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and he will give you rest from all your enemies around you, so that you will live in safety. Then to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name, there you are to bring everything I command you, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and special gifts, and all the choice possessions you have vowed to the Lord. And there rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levites from your towns who have no allotment or inheritance of their own. Be careful not to sacrifice your burnt offerings anywhere you please. Offer them only at the place the Lord will choose in one of your tribes, and there observe everything that I have commanded you." Okay, so there's three really vital instructions included in these verses, in verses 1 through 14. Number one, the Israelites need to destroy the places of worship of the Canaanites. In other words, don't reuse them. Don't take them and say, well, there's already a perfectly good altar right here. Let's just take that and use that for our worship. God says, destroy those places. Don't reuse them. Don't allow those gods to continue to be worshiped, or for the way that they worship to influence how you worship me. Second, exactly that. Don't worship God in the same way that the Canaanites worshiped. We'll dive into this here in just a few moments at the end of this chapter. But not only should you not use their places of worship, but also don't adopt their worship practices. If you remember back a couple of chapters ago in chapters 7 through 10, we explored some of the practices of the Canaanite people, some of the things that I think most people can look at and say those are evil practices, like those things like child sacrifice. He's going to mention that specifically again in this chapter at the end. Like that's an evil practice. Don't worship the same way that the Canaanites worshipped. Okay, so destroy the places of worship of the Canaanites. Don't worship the way the Canaanites worshipped. And then third, there's going to be a specific place to worship God. Moses doesn't tell us where that place is going to be, but God is going to reveal a specific place where his name is going to reside. And that's the place that you're to worship God. And there you're supposed to worship God alone. Back in verse 8, I love what Moses says, because to me it's very relatable. It makes a lot of sense with what I know about myself, and certainly what I think I know about others too. But this is what Moses says in verse 8. He says, "You're not to do as we do here today, everyone doing as they see fit." Right? So they're in the wilderness. They're wandering around. They don't have a specific place to worship. They've been given the law. They've been given some instructions. And Moses is like, okay, well, you can't just worship however. Like, there's going to be some specifics, to Denver's point earlier. Like, we're going to have to get a little bit more organized in how we do this. But this is kind of the human condition. We see this on repeat throughout all of Scripture, where oftentimes the temptation of humanity is to think, well, I know the right thing to do. I know what's best. Has anyone ever done this or seen someone do, like, I know how to do the things the right way, and sometimes we might get it right, but sometimes we get it really, really wrong too. One of the phrases that I feel like I hear often today out in the world is, "Well, God wants me to be happy, right?" Well, God wanting you to be happy has justified a lot of really sinful, evil behavior throughout human history, right? Like that's not a very good indicator of what's right. Another one that you might hear today is, well, love is love, right? Like God is love and love is love. Like we should be able to love however and whoever we want to, right? That's a very popular line today. But there are certain ways and certain things that we know go against God's will, even if we love it. You can love, fill in the blank, to an unhealthy extent and an unhealthy degree. There's all kinds of ways that we could talk about that today. And so the main point I want to make is we are not the best judges of what is right and true in the world. Sometimes we might be tempted to think that we are. We might think, well, I've got a really good head on my shoulders. I think I kind of know what the right thing to do is here. And Moses is telling the people, don't do whatever you think is right. Do what God tells you is right. What God is revealing to you is right. And so when you go into this new land and you witness some of these altars that are sitting there, you might think that's a really nice looking altar. I bet if we just put God's name on it instead of Baal, like we could just reuse that. And God's like, no, like that. Don't just do what you think is right. Do what I am instructing you, what I am telling you is right. God is not just giving them these laws to make life harder for them. He's giving them these laws because he knows human history. Humans are not good judges of what is truly right and best. God knows what is right and best. And so that's why he shares this law with them, to help them understand and to follow him, to live in right relationship with him. So Moses is going to give them more instructions about how and why they ought to worship in specific ways. And one of those that he gives comes in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 23. This is a pretty important one when it comes to the Old Testament. And so in Deuteronomy 12, 23, it says, be sure that you do not eat the blood of an animal, because the blood is the life, and you must not eat the life with the meat. Okay, who in here is a hunter? One? Only one? Okay, I was gonna say we're in Decatur, y'all. Like, when you hunt, well, okay, I'm not gonna go too deep into this because you guys are the experts and I am not the expert, right? But this is one way of looking at the world, and what I think is there's so much that we could dive into on this verse. But let me just say it this way, maybe tonight is we are not the ones who are the creators or sustainers of life. And so when Moses gives an instruction like this, and he talks about the sacrifices that they're to make and how they're to kill an animal and how they're to properly dispose of different parts of the animal and the blood, the reason for this is, again, not because God's just trying to make life hard for us. A great reminder that we can take away from a verse like this is God is the one who creates and sustains life, and that's not any of our responsibility. We're not the judge of who gets life and who gets death. And so when it comes to something like sacrifice requires death. Something has to die in order to be sacrificed. But the point of the action of sacrifice is not simply to kill something. And the point is not even about what it is that is killed, even though God's going to give a lot of explanation and detail about how you're supposed to kill these animals and which animals are meant for which sacrifices. The point I want to make tonight is to recognize, if we're not the right judges of what is right and best, then we're certainly not the best judges of what is life and who ought to receive life and death. But God is the right judge of those things. Sacrifice is about recognizing who God is and giving him your trust. And so in verse 23, by not eating the blood, perhaps it can be a reminder to us that we are not God and we are not the one who's in charge of life. That's God's job. Is that making sense with us at all? This is one of those ones that it feels very foreign to us today. It feels very removed from our context. But I think if we put it in those terms, that God is the ultimate judge of life rather than us, I think that helps me at least understand a little bit about what some of these laws might mean. Chapter 12 ends in a very similar way to the way the chapter begins. So in verse 29, it says, the Lord your God will cut off before you the nations that you're about to invade and dispossess. But when you've driven them out and settled in their land, and after they've been destroyed before you, be careful not to be ensnared by inquiring about their gods, saying, well, how do these nations serve their gods? We'll do the same. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods. So see that you do all I command you. Do not add to it or take away from it. Israel is going to have a hard time relinquishing control to God throughout their whole history. They're going to have a hard time saying, you know what God says is the right thing. Sometimes they go to one extreme and they say, well, not only what God says, but let's add to it and let's make all these other laws. And at other times they're going to go the other direction and say, well, does God really know what he's talking about? And what about these other things that we could do or try? And they're going to be all over the map, just like we are today, all over the map in how we follow God. But God says, see to it that you do what I command you, because God is the right judge of what is truly good. He's the judge of life. He's the one that we should follow rather than ourselves. Some of the Canaanite worship practices, specifically here, he mentions child sacrifice. We know that these things are wrong. And so it's in following God's law, it's in following God's will that we can discover that there is a right way to worship God. We believe this, don't we? We believe there's a right way to worship God. It's why we do certain things and we don't do others. For example, today we gather together on Sundays and Wednesdays. We pray prayers. We sing songs of praise and gratitude to God, but we don't get together and offer sacrifices anymore, do we? Last time I checked, we didn't have very many blood sacrifices going on in our worship services, because we understand that there are certain ways that we are meant to worship, that God has called us to worship. And over the course of both Old and New Testaments, we begin to see a picture of how it is that we can live our lives and worship to God. There are some things that are never right to do. Child sacrifice is one of those. But we know that there are things to do that are right, giving our hearts to God, giving our praise and our gratitude to him, taking care of orphans and widows, because we know that's what James said true religion is. These are the kinds of things that we do to worship, and we don't do other things. Do what? It's God's law. Yeah, we try to follow him, and we try to obey what we find in Scripture. Okay, so chapter 12 is a lot to do with where to worship and how to worship. When we enter into chapter 13, it's a lot to do with how not to worship. We're going back to the topic of idolatry. That's really what chapter 13 is all about. Those who know the future stories in Israel know that this is going to be a major problem. Israel is prone to idolatry because human beings are prone to idolatry. Our gods today are not the same gods in some ways that they worshiped. They're not gods of wood and stone. Our gods often are gods of digital screens and comfort, right? Those are the types of gods that we tend to worship today. And we might think, well, it's really easy to see idolatry in the Old Testament when you build an altar to something and you begin to worship one of these ancient gods, Canaanite gods or the gods of the people around them. But chances are that if you were to look around in our world today, it'd be pretty easy to identify who and what someone is worshiping. I'll give you 2 clues, and we'll talk more about these next week. But it's really easy to tell what somebody's worshiping by where they spend their money and where they spend their time. If you were to show me a bank statement for somebody, I could probably tell you some of the things that they might be worshiping. If you were to show me somebody's daily planner and calendar, I might be able to tell you, hint at some of the things that they might be worshiping. Idols today are just as easy to see as they were in the ancient world. Sometimes we just close our eyes so that we can pretend like we're not participating in any form of idolatry ourselves. I won't get on a soapbox tonight, but let me just say this. All idols, everything seeking our worship, wants not just your time and your money, it wants your heart. It wants your allegiance. And so whatever that thing is in your life or the life of somebody else, if it's just asking you for just a little bit of attention, just a little bit of money, just a little bit of time, just a little bit, be careful, because it rarely is just a little bit. Most idols don't want just a small piece of you, they want all of you. And so if it asks you to spend just a few dollars and you'll get successful real fast, you'll get so much benefit from it. If it asks for just a few moments every day, be careful, because those few moments can easily turn into hours and hours. Guard your heart. Only give your allegiance to God, because God, as it turns out, thinks it's really serious business. This passage in chapter 13 is one of those passages that can be really hard for us to read, but it's important that we do, because this is how seriously God takes the topic of idolatry. So starting in verse 1, it says, "If a prophet or one who foretells by dreams appears among you and announces to you a sign or wonder, and if the sign or wonder spoken of takes place and the prophet says, well, let's follow other gods you've not known, and let's worship them, you must not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer. The Lord is testing you to find out whether you love him with all your heart and with all your soul. It's the Lord your God you must follow, and him you must revere. Keep his commands and obey him, serve him and hold fast to him. That prophet or dreamer must be put to death for inciting rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. That prophet or dreamer tried to turn you from the way the Lord your God commanded you to follow, and you must purge the evil from among you. If your very own brother or your son or daughter or the wife that you love or your closest friend secretly entices you saying, well, let's go and worship other gods, gods that neither you nor your ancestors have known, gods of the peoples around you, whether near or far from one end of the land to the other, do not yield to them or listen to them. Show them no pity. Do not spare them or shield them. You must certainly put them to death. Your hand must be the first in putting them to death, and then the hands of all the people. Stone them to death because they tried to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And then all Israel will hear and be afraid, and no one among you will do such an evil thing again. This is a hard passage for us to read today. It seems brutal. It seems, in some ways, unfair. But I want to make the case tonight that the reason it feels that way to us is maybe because we don't take idolatry as seriously as God does. God thinks it's so serious that you have to get rid of it, so much so that if you have to put it to death, that's exactly what you do. So let me approach this from maybe two different angles tonight to maybe just get our minds thinking a little bit about how we understand a passage like this. So the first one is going to be kind of a metaphorical angle, and the second one is going to be kind of a literal angle when we read a passage like this. Okay, so first, let's deal with kind of a metaphorical reading of this passage. So hundreds of years later, when Jesus begins his ministry, he's going to come on the scene. He's going to preach the Sermon on the Mount. And when he preaches the Sermon on the Mount, he includes this section that he says, if your right hand causes you to sin, or if your eye causes you to sin, cut it off and pluck it out. I don't see very many Christians walking around today without their hand or without their eye, right? We have figured out a way to read that passage somewhat metaphorically. Understanding that Jesus means that this is serious business. Like if you've got sin and temptation in your life, you got to get rid of it. Even if that means cutting off a hand or plucking out an eye. That's how seriously God takes sin. It needs to be rooted out. It needs to be removed from our lives. It needs to be killed. So as followers of Jesus, not only do we hear Jesus say something like that, but we also hear him say things like turn the other cheek, pray for our enemies and those who persecute us, take up our crosses, lay down our swords. And so when we read passages like this, and we read passages about cutting off a hand or plucking out an eye, it makes good sense to me that God's not commending to us through Jesus violence. He's not commanding self-harm to be done to us. That makes good sense to me, right? Like I think God is more compassionate than that. And yet, we also understand the lesson very clearly that God takes this thing called sin very seriously, and we need to get away from it, whatever it takes at whatever costs. And so if we were to read a passage like Deuteronomy chapter 13 tonight and think about it in this kind of same metaphorical reading, we might change the opening verse where it says, if a prophet or one who foretells by dreams appears among you and announces to you a sign or wonder, ... We might change that and instead read, well, if an advertisement or a public figure or a speaker or an influencer or even a preacher, if somebody like that comes before you and begins to try to tell you all the wonders and signs and amazing things that if you'll just do this, if you'll just follow this, if you'll just buy this, well, I think we could probably read in this metaphorical reading of this that we don't need to listen to that person. Because as it turns out, those things aren't going to be the things that revolutionize and change our lives. Chances are they're going to be the thing that convinces us to spend some money, to throw some money in this way, to give our attention, to give our worship and our time to those things, but they're not going to be the thing that ultimately fulfills us or changes us or helps us. And so this leads us back into a conversation that we've begun here in the last couple of weeks about the reading of these passages that feels kind of harsh, right? If somebody leads you into this, even if it's a close friend, a relative, a brother, a sister, a wife, a friend, you're to put that person to death. And so if we set aside the metaphorical reading of this and we explore the literal reading of this, which, by the way, probably would have been exactly how the original hearers of this read this and understood Moses to be talking about, then we've got a little bit of work to do to understand exactly what is going on here. I recommended to you a couple of weeks ago a book called Is God a Moral Monster by an author named Paul Copan. And I'd like to read a couple of quotations from that book tonight that might help us understand what we can do with a passage like this. So he says this. He says, mediums or diviners, sorcerers or soothsayers were prohibited from living in Israel on pain of death. We find that law in Leviticus 19:26. And he says, those predicting the future through omens or signs, telling fortunes, attempting to contact spiritual or demonic beings, they were outlawed in Israel. Likewise, false prophets who sought to lead Israel into idolatry were to be capitally punished. And he references here the very passage that we've just read. A little bit further on in the paragraph, he says, none of that was to take place in Israel. God's people were to be different from the nations around them. They were to focus on life and the God of life, not the dead or false deities. So here you've got Moses commanding the people. If somebody comes to you and says, I've got this amazing prophecy to tell you, I've got this amazing news to tell you about this God you've never heard of before, they're not following the God of life. They're following a different way, a different path that leads to the dead or to false deities, and they are not to be listened to and not to be followed. Copan goes on to say that while this might sound extremely harsh to us, overdone in our modern ears, within its context, he says Israel's punishments were tame compared to the more brutal law codes and the ruthlessness of other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Israel, when God gives these commands to them, perhaps is drawing them forward in history to say, I'm not going to take you from point A to point Z in one moment, but you can bet I'm going to take you from point A to point B and continue along that path. Copan goes on, he says, certain Old Testament laws and punishments were inferior to creational ideals. So when you read in Genesis chapter 1 that God created male and female in his image, bearing his image, that we are all image bearers of God, we also find out a couple of chapters later that that image is able to be corrupted and marred in people. And so we understand that the world that we live in today is not the world that God created it to be or wants it to be. And yet, Copan says, the Sinai legislation presents genuinely remarkable, previously unheard of legal and moral advances. If you take the whole law and you were to look at it and compare it to other ancient laws, you would see that God is actually commanding something vastly different than the law codes and religious codes of other ancient cultures. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye. Well, even before it was said an eye for an eye, do you know what it was said? An eye for a life. You take my eye, I kill you. In the Deuteronomistic, you guys know that word is so hard for me. Whew. In the Deuteronomistic law, in the Leviticus law, God commands there can only be a certain limit. If somebody does something to you, you don't go farther in retaliating against them. And then Jesus comes along and he takes the next step and he says, not only is it not an eye for an eye, but I tell you to pray for those who persecute you. Pray for those who take those things away from you. Another author and Christian thinker, Justin Brierley, says it this way. He says, God may choose to accommodate the cultural norms of a society as it is, rather than move it immediately to where it should be. Much of the Old Testament is the story of God gradually drawing hard-hearted and sinful people out of the practices of the pagan cultures around them towards a radical new awareness of his moral law and his perfect love. So what this does, what Copan and Brierley's explanations do and don't do, is they don't excuse sinful behavior or sin. But they do help us to understand the context in which these laws were written and how that context vastly differs from the one in which we read them today. These laws happened in a specific time and place, and God worked in that specific time and place with the people and the practices that they understood to work his purposes, to begin to change them from who they were to who God was calling them to be. And by the way, God is still doing that today because God works through sinful people. I don't know why, but that's what God has chosen to do. God has chosen because he loves his people. He loves his creation. You are sinful and far from me, and I'm going to begin to draw you closer and closer to me. And how you do that is by following me and not following these other gods and these idols that are in your midst. So in chapter 12, we saw that there is a right way to worship God. And in chapter 13, we see that there is a wrong way to worship, and it leads to idolatry. Does that make sense? I don't pretend like that summarizes and answers all of our questions and all of the problems when we read a chapter like chapter 13. But we clearly see that there is a wrong way to worship God. There's a wrong way to worship. And if we worship in that wrong way, it can so easily lead us into idolatry. And God is calling us out of that and into proper worship of him. And so right on the heels of that, right on the heels of how to worship and where to worship and how not to worship and who not to worship, now Moses enters into a section that I'm sure you're just all jazzed up to read and think about together tonight. Food laws. Food laws in chapter 14. Moses is going to get into the idea of what's clean and what's unclean. He's going to remind them that they're even something as simple as their diet needs to reflect how they are following God, how they're choosing to live their lives by listening to his commands. And so what we're going to see in verses 3 and 4, verses 9, 11, 19, and 21, Moses is going to give them specific instructions about the types of animals and the types of different foods that they can and can't eat. And so verses 3 and 4, there are certain animals that they can eat that are not detestable. Verse 9, there's fish that have both fins and scales that the people are allowed to eat. In verse 11, they're only allowed to eat clean birds, nothing that eats dead animals or scavenges for food. Verse 19, don't eat insects, they're unclean. I wasn't tempted. Thank you, though, Moses. And then in verse 21, don't eat anything that's already dead when you find it. Okay. Yeah, no roadkill. It's convenient. It's already there. It's ready to go. Don't touch it. There's a lot of reasons that we could dive into tonight and talk about these, but I've spent the majority of our time on chapters 12 and 13, and I don't pretend to be an expert on the laws about what is clean and unclean that we can and cannot eat according to God in this chapter. But here's what I will say. The reason that Moses gives these laws to the people, the reason that God gives these laws is because Israel is meant to be a light to the nations. And so even something as simple as what you eat needs to show the people around you that you are doing things differently. You're following God, not like these other nations, not like these other gods. You're doing something different that reveals to the people who God is. This group of people, the people of Israel, they're meant to be a blessing to the world. It's hard to be a blessing to the world if you're exactly like the world. And so God gives them a different way to eat. These are the things that are good for you. These are the things that are healthy. Roadkill probably leads to a lot of disease, right? And so eat these things. This is what will help you to be a good, flourishing human being. God gives them instructions about what is clean and what is unclean. And so even their food can be a part of their worship. So we might say it this way. In chapter 12, there's a right way to worship God. In chapter 13, there's a wrong way to worship and it leads to idolatry. In chapter 14, there is a right way to live in order for our lives to worship God. So food might seem like one of those things that's strange to us to have all these different laws about it. And yet God wants to reveal to the world through them that they are living differently, that God has called them out, and that God is desiring something for them and not just from them. Okay, so hundreds of years later after this, Jesus is going to come along, and Jesus is going to have some things to say about even these laws that we read about in Deuteronomy chapter 14, right? Jesus is going to help us to know that it's not just about what you eat, but about why you're eating what you're eating, right? So it's not just about the food that you put into you that makes you clean or unclean, Jesus says. It's about the heart that you have while you do those things. It's about your heart that makes you clean or unclean. Your intentions is what God is really focused in on. And I think that helps us in our world today too, right? That's part of the reason why we're Christians and not just Jews, is because we like our bacon. There you go. There you go. Okay, let me say one final thing about chapter 14, because the end of chapter 14, in some ways, almost has nothing to do with what we've talked about tonight, but it is a beautiful, amazing portion of this chapter that I don't think we can skip over without saying something tonight about it. So let me read these verses to us out of chapter 14, starting in verse 22. Moses says, "Be sure to set aside a tenth of all that your fields produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine, and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God at the place that he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. But if that place is too distant, and you've been blessed by the Lord your God and cannot carry your tithe, because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is so far away, then exchange your tithe for silver and take the silver with you and go to the place the Lord your God will choose, and use the silver to buy whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, or other fermented drink, anything you wish. Then you and your households shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice." Okay, and if we were just to stop there, That would sound really great. God is making a provision for the people. He's making something easier for them. For once in the law, something becomes easier. Like, okay, sell your animal, take the money, and then go buy another animal when you get there to worship with. But that's not the reason that God says this. The reason he says this is in these final verses. He says, "Do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment, they have no inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows, those who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the works of your hands." The reason that God gives these instructions here at the end of chapter 14 is because God knows that there's two things that can change us more than anything else, I think. The two things are, if you will practice regular generosity, if you will give away what you have, and if you will care for the vulnerable. If you'll do those two things, I think those are the two most powerful things that you can do that will change your life. If you will do those two things, they will make you more like God than probably almost anything else in all of the world can do. We tend to think of the supernatural, the miraculous, like those are the things that's what that'll reveal God to me. That'll help me to know what God's heart is about. But over and over again throughout Scripture, we see that the miraculous is easily forgotten. It's easily underwhelming. When God parts the Red Sea and the Israelites walk through on dry land, he rescues them from the army of Egypt. The waters come back together. And like the very next day, the people are like, we had some pretty good food in Egypt. Maybe we should just go back. Like, y'all, God just rescued you from there. Like, you just walked through a sea on dry ground. Like, the miraculous, for some reason, it doesn't stick with us. It doesn't compute. When Jesus does things like heal a person of a disease or a disability, but he happens to do it on the Sabbath, we focus more on the Sabbath than we do on the healing. Like, the miraculous doesn't capture our hearts. It doesn't change our lives in the way that we think it will. But things like tithing 10% of our money and our livelihood and giving it to God and trusting that he's going to do great things with it and provide for us, that's going to change you. Caring for the vulnerable, the people who don't have anything, the people in your midst that don't have the ability to provide for themselves, that is something that most cultures and people groups throughout history have neglected and found completely unnecessary until Jesus showed up. And then when Jesus showed up, we realized that there's almost nothing else that we can do that is more powerful or that shows us who God is more succinctly and better than this. There's two key moral virtues that most people in our part of the world believe. We believe them to be so obvious that we don't even have to think about them. Human beings have worth and dignity, and that we have a duty to care for one another. And the reason that we have those two moral beliefs and virtues, even if you're not a Christian, almost every single person I know believes in those two things, is because of a passage like this one in Deuteronomy 14. It didn't come out of nowhere. It didn't just spring into consciousness, because you can look back on human history and see that most cultures throughout human history have not cared for their poor. They've not cared for the vulnerable. They have not believed that human life had so much dignity and value that you couldn't sacrifice someone if it was for the right reason. We saw that 2 chapters ago in chapter 12. People were willing to sacrifice their own children to the gods to try to make them happy. That's most of human history, until God shows up and gives a law like this one, until Jesus shows up and helps us to understand God's heart and what God really is all about. The reason we believe those two things is not because we came up with them on our own. The reason we believe them is because of God's revelation that we find in Scripture, passages like Deuteronomy 14, and especially the person of Jesus. And so God tells the people through Moses, if you want to be different, if you want to be set apart from the rest of the world around you, trust me. Give 10%. Practice generosity and care for the people around you who can't care for themselves. Nothing else in this world will get you closer to God's heart than those things. And you'll see God do amazing things if you're willing to do that. Okay, we covered a lot of ground tonight. Probably covered it all inadequately. There's probably a lot more that could be said about each of the different aspects of what we've talked about tonight. But hopefully that gives us a glimpse into part of the reason why God is sharing this law through Moses again with the people. He wants them to come close to him. He wants them to follow him. And they're not going to get there on their own. They're only going to get there if they listen to his commands, if they listen to who he is and follow his way. And so by the time we get to Jesus, some of these laws perhaps become unnecessary. And yet the idea behind them is to bring us in closer connection with God, draw us to right relationship with him, help make us holy where before we are unholy. And certainly when we get to Jesus, he's going to help us to do that for us. Next week, we're going to continue talking about Deuteronomy chapters 15 and 16. I teased it earlier. Really fascinating stuff to do with debt cancellation, slavery and freeing slaves, to do with worship, the festivals, the different festivals that the people of Israel still to this day follow. So there's going to be some fascinating conversation to have next week. So I hope you'll join us again. Feel free to read those 2 chapters in advance. We'll cover most everything in those 2 chapters. Okay, we're over time, but I'm willing to give time for a comment if anybody has one, something significant that was left out or that ought to be said tonight. Everyone's like, we're ready to go home. You've talked a lot, Jake. Oh, don't bring up food. Yeah, so not everyone's eating dinner, right? Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't think we're going to talk much about food next week. So, well, we talked mostly about roadkill. That can't sound very appetizing. All right. All right. Well, let's close with prayer. Denver's going to say our closing prayer, and then we'll dismiss from there.
Our Father who art in heaven, we thank you for all the many blessings that you have given us and for the chance that we've had to come here and study your word and study the law in Deuteronomy, and as you were trying to bring those people to you. Father, help us always to try to come closer to you, to help those that need help, and assist those that are disadvantaged and are around us, and show that compassion and kindness that you have shown to us, but also we need to reflect that back to the world around us. In Christ's name, amen.